The room was colder than it should have been, diplomatic, sterile, calculated. Thick mahogany chairs. Cameras turned off. Flags folded neatly behind thick glass. This wasn't a summit. It was a test. Across from Ibrahim Traoré sat a man who had outmaneuvered generals, silenced rivals, and redrawn borders with steel and smoke, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Putin leaned back, his eyes fixed on Traoré, not as a guest, not as an ally, but as a variable. A piece in motion. Or at least, that's what he hoped he was dealing with. "We respect what you're doing," Putin said slowly, in his usual rehearsed calm. "Standing against the West, claiming independence. That takes courage." Traoré gave a polite nod. But he didn't smile. He had come for clarity, not compliments. Putin continued. "But courage without support is suicide. You can't fight the West alone. You need a friend. A shield. A partner who understands power, not just poetry." The translation echoed through the room. That's when Putin leaned in. "You're either with us, or you're with no one." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was pressure. Centuries of empire, cloaked in diplomacy. Traoré straightened in his seat, not to rise, but to plant himself. "I'm with my people." That was all he said. And it landed like a stone in the Kremlin's polished floor. Putin blinked. Just once. Then smiled, but it was thin, like ice cracking before a storm. "Be careful, Ibrahim," he said softly. "Loyalty without strategy becomes martyrdom." Traoré didn't answer. Not because he was unsure. But because he had nothing to prove. The next morning, Moscow moved quickly. A convoy arrived at Traoré's residence. No flashing lights. No cameras. Just armored calm. Inside the folder handed to him, arms deals, infrastructure loans, intelligence cooperation, all pre-written, all generously backdated. Russia wasn't asking him to kneel. It was telling him how to kneel. "We'll support your military," said the Kremlin envoy. "No strings attached. Just respect. And shared objectives." Traoré skimmed the documents. Every bullet point dripped with power, but also with quiet conditions. Satellite access, for mutual security. Counter-terrorism aid, when aligned with our interests. Wagner, security advisors, positioned indefinitely. They called it a partnership. He called it camouflaged occupation. Traoré set the papers down. "I didn't come to trade French boots for Russian ones," he said. "My people didn't bleed to swap flags. We want sovereignty, not supervision." The envoy chuckled, like he'd heard idealism before. "President Traoré," he said smoothly, "you don't want to end up like those who chose isolation." Traoré looked up. "You mean the ones your tanks drove through?" The silence was sharp now. No translation needed. Everyone in the room understood that sentence in its original language, defiance. Back in the Kremlin, Putin received the report. He read it quietly. Then folded it and slid it aside. "Still young," he muttered. "Still believes in clean lines." An advisor spoke, "Should we apply pressure?" Putin didn't answer right away. He just stood at the window, staring out at the Moscow sky. "Not yet," he said. Then, almost to himself, "Let him feel the cold first." At first, it was subtle. Satellite communications in Ouagadougou began to flicker. Fuel shipments from friendly ports were delayed. Misinformation campaigns, in Russian-accented French, began to flood social media feeds in West Africa. The goal wasn't chaos. It was confusion. Burkina Faso's youth, once unified, began arguing online. Was Traoré betraying their hope? Was he stalling? Or worse, cutting secret deals with new masters? One headline, mysteriously viral. The West left. Now the East replaces them. Traoré knew the tactic. This was textbook destabilization. And Putin? He never had to raise his voice. The world moved for him, whispers louder than bullets. His advisors were nervous. We should sign something, even a memorandum, one said. Stall them. Keep the peace. We can negotiate the rest later. But Traoré stood alone on the balcony of the presidential compound that night, staring into the city lights. He wasn't just fighting empires, he was fighting fatigue. Every direction offered submission in disguise. The next day, his foreign minister received a surprise call, from Beijing. China had seen the gap forming. And they wanted to fill it. Putin had moved first. Now she was circling. Mr. President, his chief of staff said gently, if you reject them both, we may stand alone. Traoré turned slowly. No, he said. We stand with millions. And if they squeeze us harder? Traoré's voice dropped to a whisper, but it hit like thunder. Then they'll finally see what a free man under pressure becomes. The messages came in waves, some veiled, others direct. Russian diplomats cancelled their appearance at the West African Economic Forum. Russian fuel contractors pulled out from joint ventures with no explanation. A Burkinabe intelligence source intercepted a chilling audio clip, clearly Russian. If the boy won't bow, the people will break him. His generals grew restless. Sir, we cannot afford to isolate every power bloc. But Traoré wasn't trying to isolate himself. He was trying to build something untainted. That afternoon, he held an unscheduled press conference. His team warned him against it. He went anyway. The cameras clicked. The room quieted. Then he stepped to the podium and spoke not like a politician, but like a man who had stopped apologizing for wanting his people to stand without leaning on someone else's crutch. We've been offered support in exchange for silence, he began. Offered weapons for our obedience. Protection for our loyalty. He looked into the cameras. His voice didn't rise, but the message thundered. To every foreign power, I will speak plainly. We are not seeking to be enemies. But we are no one's property. Not anymore. Reporters froze. Some smiled. Others panicked. Burkina Faso does not trade one leash for another. We walk forward. On our own. If the road is harder, so be it. The next morning, Putin watched the clip from his private residence outside Moscow. He didn't speak for a full minute. Then he simply said. He's not bluffing. One aide nodded. What now? Putin's jaw tightened. Now, we remind him what standing alone really feels like. Weeks passed, and the chill turned to frost. Russian media outlets labeled Traoré a reckless revolutionary and ungrateful puppet turned rogue. Fake videos began surfacing, protests in Burkina Faso, edited to look like riots. Anonymous telegram channels, traced to St. Petersburg, claimed military mutiny was brewing. Internally, the pressure began to show. Foreign investment stalled. Border security weakened. A series of minor attacks by unidentified militants near gold mines raised suspicions. Traoré met with his intelligence chief. Too clean, the chief said. Too targeted. Someone's funding chaos. Traoré nodded. And someone wants me to beg. But instead, he called a national assembly, not of politicians, but of village leaders, teachers, farmers, young revolutionaries, even old soldiers. A circle. No podium. No title games. The speech was private, but it leaked. Traoré's voice was raw, no teleprompter, no press polish. They're trying to starve us into silence. They want to teach us fear again. But fear is a lesson we've already passed. He looked around the room, eyes steady. I will not bow to a new flag wearing the old crown. Not to France. Not to America. And not to Russia. Thousands reposted the clip. In Mali, in Niger, even in South Africa, hashtag spread. Hashtag not your pawn. Hashtag Traoré does not kneel. In the Kremlin, Putin slammed the laptop shut. He turned to his closest advisors. Prepare the next phase, he said coldly. Then added, almost as an afterthought. Let's see if the people he serves are ready to suffer with him. Then came the strike that had been hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Without warning, Russia suspended all grain shipments to Burkina Faso under the guise of logistical reallocation. Joint mining projects quietly froze. Russian state-backed hackers began targeting Ouagadougou's finance systems. They didn't call it a sanction. But the effect was brutal. Hospitals faced fuel shortages. Banks slowed. Markets tightened like fists. The goal was clear: turn the people against Traoré. And in some quarters, it started to work. A few parliamentarians, long suspected of Russian ties, called for Traoré to reconsider our diplomatic posture. Foreign media echoed the cracks. Traoré isolated, one headline read. Charisma can't feed a nation. But the Kremlin underestimated one thing: Traoré didn't rely on PR. He relied on presence. Instead of hiding, he walked into the hardest-hit neighborhoods. No convoy. No bulletproof shield. Just him and a black linen shirt. People were shocked. Angry. Some yelled. Some cried. And he let them. Then one woman, a grocer named Isata, spoke out. You could have bent and fed us, she said. Why didn't you? Traoré looked at her, not like a president, but like a son of the same land. Because freedom that comes with chains, he said, is just a prettier prison. Silence. Then, clapping. First one hand, then 100. Then more. Not because he promised instant relief. But because he had told the truth. And in the Kremlin, where silence means planning, Putin's counsel now sounded uneasy. He's turning the pain into loyalty, one aide said. Putin didn't blink. Then make the pain louder. Not all battles are fought in public. As Traoré's defiance echoed across the continent, another war was brewing, one without uniforms or declarations. It started with whispers inside his own military. A general who had been quiet too long. A shipment of Russian arms that never arrived, but bribes that did. Old loyalties reawakened by foreign hands. A confidential report from his intelligence team confirmed it. A coup was in motion. But Traoré didn't panic. Instead, he summoned General Dabiré, the very man named in the report. In a private room with no cameras, Traoré laid down the folder. No accusations. No orders. Just a sentence. If you think I stand alone, look out the window. Dabiré hesitated. He opened the blinds. Thousands had gathered in the square, farmers, students, mothers, ex-rebels, waving handmade flags, holding signs that read. No to new masters. We bleed, we don't bow. I'm with my people. Dabiré's hands trembled. Not from fear, but from something deeper, shame. He sat down. And said only this. I was wrong. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a frustrated advisor gave Putin the update. The coup was collapsing. The army wasn't moving. Even some Russian-linked operatives had gone quiet, afraid of sparking full-on rebellion. Putin's face hardened. He's not just defying us, he said. He's infecting others. Across Africa, other leaders watched carefully. Young officers in Mali and Chad began quoting Traoré's speeches. The streets started humming with his name. And for the first time, the empire that prided itself on being unshakable, felt a tremor it didn't expect. It came at midnight Moscow time. Putin was reviewing an updated dossier titled Sahel Region, Influence Recovery Strategy. He barely looked up when his secure phone rang. The voice on the line was calm, measured, but firm. It was not from Washington. Not Paris. But from Pretoria. "Mr. President," said South Africa's foreign minister, "we've monitored your recent disruptions in Burkina Faso." Putin sat straighter. "And?" he asked. The minister didn't blink. "Back off." Putin raised an eyebrow. "You're siding with that child?" The answer came without hesitation. "We're siding with sovereignty." That was the moment Putin realized something had shifted. The very nations once quietly neutral were finding their voices, and Traoré was becoming their symbol. A symbol Russia couldn't control. And that was dangerous. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré was holding a nighttime town hall. No speech. Just dialogue. A young student stood and asked, "Why not just pretend to align with Russia until we're strong enough to stand alone?" Traoré smiled gently, not dismissively. "Because you don't practice freedom by faking submission." He paused. "If we bend to survive, we forget how to walk straight." The room erupted, not in noise, but in stillness. The kind of silence that meant everything had landed. Even in Eastern Europe, small African student unions in universities began quoting Traoré. His words were being translated, posted, graffitied on walls from Dakar to Delhi. Putin watched this new kind of war spread, not with bullets, but belief. And belief, he knew, was far harder to crush. "He's not building an army," he said aloud, alone in his office. "He's building a continent." Weeks later, an invitation landed on Putin's desk. It was unexpected. Hand-delivered by the African Union. Pan-African Independence and Sovereignty Forum, guest of honor, Ibrahim Traoré. Putin laughed at first. Then reread the envelope. The forum wasn't being held in Paris. Not in Washington. Not in Beijing. But in Bamako, Mali, a country Russia had quietly helped stabilize. Now it was openly aligning with Traoré. The message was loud. Russia may have helped push out Western powers, but it would not replace them. Still, Putin sent a delegation. Not to attend, but to observe, and report. What they saw startled them. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Chad, Guinea, and even cautious officials from South Africa and Kenya, all gathered around Traoré, not as a superior, but as a standard. There were no luxury suits. No scripted applause. Just clear-eyed speeches about self-determination, non-alignment, and not trading one empire for another. When Traoré took the stage, his voice was low, steady, yet every word hit like thunder. "We are not anti-West. We are not pro-East. We are pro-ourselves. Africa is not a battleground. It's a birthplace. And from now on, we choose what grows here." Putin's observers didn't clap. They just scribbled. Worried. Because they had seen this before. Not in Africa, but in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, even in Siberia. The look in people's eyes when someone reminded them they didn't have to serve anyone. That night, Putin reviewed the footage. He didn't speak. He just tapped the table slowly. 3 times. Then whispered. "This isn't diplomacy. It's a revolution with no bullets." Putin had seen insurgents. He'd crushed uprisings. He'd dealt with rebels, revolts, and revolutions. But this was something different. Traoré hadn't overthrown a system, he'd outgrown it. There were no tanks, no embassies burning. No treaties signed in secret. No alliances with strings. Just one man, refusing to kneel, so that millions remembered they could stand. The ripple effect had reached beyond Africa. In a private UN roundtable, smaller nations began questioning why their votes were still shaped by fear. In South America, indigenous leaders cited Traoré by name. And in Eastern Europe, opposition activists asked a chilling question. If Traoré can say no to giants, why can't we? Putin's intelligence reports used new language, ideological contagion. It wasn't policy that frightened them. It was tone. Presence. Conviction. He didn't demand loyalty. He modeled it. He didn't ask others to follow. He stood, and let them choose. When a Western reporter asked Traoré if he feared being eliminated, he gave a slight smile. I fear nothing. Not because I'm brave. But because I'm not doing this alone anymore. And that was it. In a world of empires, some fading, some hungry, one man walked between them. Not looking for power, but planting something more dangerous. Self-respect. They told him to choose a side. They offered him maps, weapons, promises, if only he'd play their game. But Ibrahim Traoré didn't want to play. He wanted to build. He didn't raise an army. He raised a standard. Not one of empire, but of dignity. While others played chess with nations, he reminded his people they weren't pawns. And in doing so, he faced what most leaders fear the most. Standing alone, without bending. But here's the truth. He was never alone. Because every time someone dares to lead without permission, every time a voice refuses to echo empire, every time a man says, I'm with my people, a new future takes root. This wasn't just a story about Russia, or Africa, or power. It was a story about what happens when someone finally says, enough, and means it.